What if one of the most repeated facts in Christianity is only half the story? What you think is true may never have been the whole truth. Most of us grew up with a statement that sounds final, almost untouchable. No one has ever seen God. It's the theological speed limit, an absolute barrier. Repeated in sermons, Bible studies, and debates, often to end the conversation. But here's the rupture. The Bible itself refuses to let the conversation end. Because right in the heart of Exodus, there is a man who doesn't just pray from a distance. He walks into the cloud. He stands where the mountain burns. And Scripture dares to say that God spoke to him face to face. Pause there. If the infinite cannot be encountered without annihilation, what exactly is Moses doing in the center of the fire? Is he breaking the rules, or is he following a survival protocol? We've forgotten how to read. We've been reading the most famous line in Scripture with modern binary eyes, trying to compress an infinite presence into a flat 2D definition. This isn't really a question about Moses' importance. It's far more unsettling. Who was he actually meeting, and how did a human being survive that encounter? Tonight, we're not just resolving a contradiction. We're decoding a presence that accepts the brokenness of a rock so that a man might live. And it all begins where the tension refuses to disappear. At first glance, Scripture confronts us with an unsolvable contradiction. On one side, it declares no one can see the face of God and live. Yet in the same narrative, the Lord speaks to Moses face to face as a man speaks with his friend. To the modern mind trained in binary logic, this feels unacceptable. Either one line is symbolic or the other is false, but the Bible was never designed as a system of logical proofs. It operates as a structure of revelation where tension is not a defect, but an invitation into depth. These statements aren't competing. They reveal two inseparable dimensions of God's nature transcendence, God utterly beyond overwhelming to finite creatures. Immanence, God stepping into history, space, and relationship. Scripture doesn't ask us to flatten the tension. It demands we carry it. The real crisis, then, is not the text, but our reading. Many arguments collapse here because of proof texting isolating a verse and forcing it to answer questions it was never meant to answer alone. Ancient Hebrew thought doesn't reduce truth to single statements. It communicates reality through paradox. So we look closely at the Hebrew. When Scripture says God spoke to Moses face to face, the phrase is panim el panim. Not biological observation, radical intimacy. Not anatomical sight, unmediated access. No dreams, no riddles, no angelic buffer. But how can intimacy exist if no one can see God and live? The answer is divine accommodation. The problem isn't just a moral gap, it's an ontological mismatch. Finite beings aren't built to withstand unfiltered divine presence. Full intensity holiness wouldn't be judgment, it would be disintegration. So Moses' encounter isn't contradiction, it's calibration. God doesn't change who he is. He calibrates his glory to the capacity of the observer. Here, Orthodox theology adds a crucial distinction: essence and energies. God's essence. Ousia, unknowable, unapproachable. God's energies, energia, how he makes himself known and active in the world. Moses does not see the essence, no human ever has. But Moses encounters the energies, real, divine, transformative. Modern science gives a helpful analogy. God's absolute glory is like the core of a black hole, an infinite concentration of power. Cross the event horizon unprotected, and you're torn apart, yet its effects, radiation, gravity, are observable and real. Same reality, different access. That's why Scripture uses anthropomorphic language, face, hand, back, not to describe God's biology, but degrees of accessibility. Seeing the face is total exposure, Not seeing the face is protection from annihilation. And panim el panim is direct communion without intermediaries yet mercifully restrained. Think software, the source code is powerful and dangerous to touch directly. The user interface allows real interaction without system collapse. Same system, non-destructive access. Now the ancient Near Eastern context sharpens the edge. In a world of absolute monarchs, the king's face was political authority. To see the face of the great king meant receiving a legal commission. Only trusted officials, viziers, viceroys could approach. Anyone else would die. So when Moses sees Yahweh, the claim is staggering. Moses isn't merely praying. He's being deputized, the authorized representative of the sovereign of the cosmos. This is not casual spirituality. It's theophany eternity rupturing into historical time. Here's the twist. Moses didn't see God because he was spiritually superior. He saw God because he was consecrated, shielded, prepared for an encounter, charged with holiness. In Scripture, holiness isn't merely moral purity, it's concentrated divine presence, life-giving but dangerous without mediation. And the buried question rises again. If the infinite Father cannot be seen, then who is this person walking through history, eating with Abraham, speaking from fire, revealing divine authority without destroying those who encounter him? Could the image of the invisible God have been active long before Bethlehem? That question opens the next layer of the mystery, the identity of the visible Yahweh. And that is where the story becomes unsettling. Modern readers hear face-to-face and imagine optics, eye contact, visual proximity. But in ancient Jewish thought, seeing the face was never primarily about eyesight, it was about standing. In theology, we must distinguish optics from status, what the eyes perceive, versus where a person is permitted to stand. In Hebrew, panim face signifies public presence, relational exposure, authorized proximity, and it's always plural. That detail matters. God's face isn't a static object captured from one angle. It suggests a multidimensional presence, a divine plurality of approach calibrated into a singular relationship. So panim el panim isn't biology. It's radical access, the collapse of barriers between human and divine. Nowhere is this clearer than the politics of the ancient Near East. Seeing the king's face was legal language. It wasn't curiosity. It was commission. Only the vizier, viceroy, royal deputy could approach. To see the king's face was to receive the signet ring, the seal of authority. You weren't merely a subject. You became a representative. So when Moses stands before Yahweh, face to face, he's not merely present. He's being deputized, the earthly shadow of a heavenly reality. In modern terms, Moses has something like diplomatic immunity in sacred space, authorized to approach the divine event horizon without being torn apart. Think the White House millions see the president on screens, but only a few have Secret Service clearance to enter the Oval Office. They don't just see the president. They have standing. Moses didn't just see God. Moses had clearance. Which raises the sobering question, if the issue isn't whether you see God, but whether you're permitted to stand before him, what functions as that authorization in your spiritual life? The difference grows clearer when we compare Moses to the prophets. They encounter God through media dreams, visions, symbols, real but low resolution, representations that require interpretation. Moses is different. If the prophets saw God in 480p, Moses stood before a 16K reality, and yet his eyes were kept from burning out. Representation versus embodiment. Watching a documentary about space versus floating outside the spacecraft. The prophets had knowledge about God. Moses had knowledge of God. Why only one man with high-definition access? Was God being selective or protective? Maybe Moses was a fusee, a single consecrated point where divine presence could enter human history without overwhelming it. Direct access wasn't favoritism, it was containment, but even Moses' access had limits. Enter divine calibration. Moses had immediacy, not total exhaustion. Close, but not consumed. God doesn't become smaller. God creates a buffer zone, a space where infinity doesn't crush finitude. Like an opera played at a volume your eardrums can survive. Same music, calibrated intensity. Or electricity, you can hold a charging phone, but touch the high-voltage line feeding a city, and you die. Moses held the device. He wasn't the power plant. So the demand to see God fully often becomes a demand for annihilation. If you insist on total exposure to the infinite, are you seeking truth or self-destruction? And here's the reversal: face-to-face doesn't exalt Moses. It magnifies divine condescension. Moses didn't climb Sinai and force God's hand. God descended. God chose human language, human categories, friendship over distance. Like a genius explaining relativity to a 5-year-old with apples and drawings. The child feels understood. The relationship is real. But the cost is borne by the genius who compresses vastness into a child-sized world. Face-to-face isn't Moses grasping God. It's God making himself graspable. Which brings us to the unsettling detail. If Moses already stood in God's presence, why does he still plead? Show me your glory. Why does something remain unseen? And why does God answer with compassionate refusal? You cannot see my face, but I will place you in the cleft of the rock. Why the rock? Why the covering hand? And why show only God's back in ancient thought? The back is the trace left after movement, the afterglow of action. Could Moses be seeing not God's form, but God's trajectory, not the essence, but the unfolding plan? The afterglow of history itself, a plan that becomes fully visible only when that same God turns to face humanity. That's where the mystery breaks open, because the rock of Sinai is about to meet the rock of all ages. If God has no physical body, face and back can't be biological, they're theological. Here, biblical thought moves beyond anthropomorphism into apophatic theology. God in his essence remains incomprehensible. This isn't evasion, it's mercy. Classical theology distinguishes essence and energies. Essence, God as he is in himself, unapproachable, infinite. Energies, God as he moves toward creation, actions, presence, self-disclosure in history. So the symbolism becomes precise. The face represents the essence, undiluted reality. The back represents the energy-strewn encounter at survivable intensity. Not poetry for poetry's epistemological mercy. God is transcendent, in his face, immanent, in his back. Moses isn't denied truth. He's protected from collapse. The symbolism deepens with the Hebrew, for back a career behind after what comes later. A word soaked in time. In the Hebrew imagination, we don't walk into the future, facing forward. We move backward into time. Our eyes face the past, known, visible. Our backs face the future, unknown, unseen. So to see God's back is to see him, where he's most visible to humans in the trail of history already traveled. Heschel suggested we rarely recognize God in the immediacy of the moment. We recognize him in hindsight by tracing his movement across time. Moses isn't watching God turn away. He's learning how humans perceive the divine, not by staring into the blinding present, but by discerning patterns in what has unfolded. Picture a massive ship at night. Look straight down turbulence and foam. Nothing makes sense. Look far behind the wake, emerges long, luminous, unmistakable. Not the ship, but undeniable evidence of presence, direction, power. And the wake becomes visible only with distance. Perspective requires distance. Maybe we can't see God's face in the now, not because he's absent, but because we lack the spiritual distance to perceive the scale of his glory. This limitation is necessary because holiness is ontological intensity, the high voltage of being. There's an ontological gap between creator and creature. Cross it casually, and you don't get enlightened, you get destroyed. A bulb glows at 110 volts. Feed it 1,000,000 volts, and it doesn't shine brighter, it disintegrates. The issue isn't electricity, it's capacity. Moses isn't spared because he's unworthy. He's spared because he's finite. God's refusal isn't rejection, it's system preservation. In modern terms, God's back is a compatibility. Layer the divine interface that keeps finite biological hardware from crashing when it tries to process infinite code. Same God, different access protocol. And the mystery deepens. The text says God covers Moses with his hand. In Hebrew imagery, the hand is never random. It's the execution of divine will, the active force that intervenes, delivers, protects. If the face is too bright and the back is God's trail, then the hand is the shield. But who or what is this hand between the fire and the man? Metaphor agency within God's self-expression. Then the final detail, Moses isn't placed behind a rock. He's placed inside a cleft. The rock had to be broken. There's no safety in solid stone, only in stone that has been opened, so the unavoidable question: what does it mean for the foundation of the universe to be cracked open so a human might live? Because if Moses survived only by hiding in a broken rock, then the real revelation isn't what Moses saw, it's what stood between him and the glory. And that leads straight to the heart of the mystery, where Sinai's cleft rock begins to echo the shadow of a far greater mediator. Moses does not stand exposed before glory. He is placed into the rock, and he is covered by the hand of God. These are not embellishments. They are a survival protocol. If holiness is ontological intensity, the raw density of divine being, then the text answers a technical question. How does a finite organism remain intact when infinite presence passes by? Not endurance, not spiritual heroism, but placement within an infrastructure of grace. The Hebrew word for rock here isn't selah. It's tur, not just geology, but a title, the Rock of Israel. So when God places Moses into the cleft of the Tur, the claim is radical. Moses isn't hidden by God as hidden in God. Paradox. God is the only refuge from God. The same reality that would consume Moses unmediated becomes protection when he's positioned correctly. And this isn't static. Centuries later, Paul looks back and says, the rock followed them. Not just a mountain of presence, mobile and relational. The rock Moses stood within wasn't merely a place, it was accompaniment. But Moses isn't placed behind the rock. He's placed inside a cleft. The rock isn't intact, it's opened. A flawless foundation offers no entry. To become refuge, it must be broken. Integrity alone can't save. Accessibility costs. So the dangerous question, did the foundation of reality accept fracture so a human could survive divine presence? Is Sinai's cleft Turin or the shadow of wounds that appear later? Then the second layer. God covers Moses with his hand. In A&E terms, a king's hand is personal sponsorship. This one stands under my authority and protection. This is mediated immediacy, direct encounter made survivable through personal mediation. God doesn't deploy an impersonal barrier. He applies himself. Irenaeus spoke of the two hands of God, the Word and the Spirit. When God covers Moses, he is not using a tool. He is engaging relationally. Shield, filter, friend at once. Now the physics of flight at 30,000 feet. The environment is lethal. The cabin isn't luxury, it's pressurized necessity. For Moses, the cleft rock is his pressurized cabin in the vacuum of the infinite. Same altitude, same sky. Only one position is survivable. And Moses doesn't find the cleft or build shelter. God says, I will place you. Safety before holiness isn't achieved, it's assigned. Grace isn't an emotion. It's infrastructure engineered to bear pressures no human could withstand. Moses survives not by stabilizing the aircraft, but by remaining where he's been placed. So the final convergence, if the rock is a divine title and the hand is divine action, and both shield humanity from unbearable glory, then is God using God himself to protect humanity from God himself. This is where Sinai resolves the mystery of the visible Yahweh, fully God, yet mediator of God. The one who moves with Israel, who accepts the fracture of the rock so humans can find refuge in the fire. And that the identity is the bridge between Sinai's smoke and the wood of the cross. Because the mystery of the cleft rock doesn't end on the mountain. It follows history until the rock breaks open once more. So in the end, the question was never, did Moses see God? The deeper question has always been this: what kind of God are we actually searching for? Do we want a God we can manage? A managerial God, safe, predictable, neatly contained by doctrine and comfort? Or are we willing to face a divine presence that doesn't flatter the ego but consumes it? Do we want to see but without getting too close? Do we want to understand but without being changed? Do we want glory but without stepping into the cloud where control is lost? Because the Bible doesn't tell this story to satisfy curiosity. It tells it to confront us with a choice: to remain at the edge of the presence, or to step into a space where faith stops being an idea and becomes a lived, risky experience. And maybe the cleft of the rock isn't just a place on an ancient mountain. Maybe it's the broken places in our own lives, the cracks where certainty fails, where pride collapses, and where we finally become small enough to be protected, yet close enough to see. Perhaps the most unsettling possibility is not that we cannot see God, but that He has already revealed far more than we're willing to look at. Perhaps God isn't hiding His face to remain distant. Perhaps He shows us His back, His movement through history, because we're afraid to look at where He's leading us next. That's the story as history. But now the question turns toward you. What do you think Moses encountered on that mountain? Was it symbol? Was it presence? Was it the shadow of someone yet to come? Share your thoughts in the comments. We read them, we wrestle with them, and we learn from them. And if this kind of exploration speaks to you, not easy answers, but questions with weight, consider subscribing. Not for the algorithm, but to join a community that prefers the gravity of a difficult question over the comfort of a cheap answer. Because some truths don't announce themselves. They wait for those willing to step closer.